So I just want to welcome everybody and say thanks for joining us for Unerasing Memory, Collaborative Research, Activism, Teaching, and Storytelling as Pathways for Indigenous Equity and Empowerment. My name is Eric Zimmer, and I'll be facilitating this morning's session. Across the United States, communities have often excluded Indigenous peoples and their perspectives from public memorials, museums, and other spaces of commemoration. In many cases, challenging histories of discrimination and disempowerment have been erased or masked by celebratory narratives of progress. And this roundtable showcases several collaborative public history projects rooted in community engagement, pedagogy, activism, and truth-telling. It explores strategies for working with and for Native communities to help them reclaim their history, tell stories of resilience in the face of oppression, and leverage the lessons of the past to create a more equitable future. And we thank you all very much for joining us today and look forward to a robust discussion. Unfortunately, our colleague Marcia Small, who's a member of the Northern Cheyenne tribe and a fantastic scholar, we hope you'll look her up and look up her work, is unable to join us this morning due to unforeseen circumstances. But she did ask each of us in our presentations to do a short land acknowledgement. And as she said during our last meeting before the session, and I'm of course paraphrasing her here, but she said we should do a land acknowledgement not because it's trendy, but because all of our work emanates from the land, and to do it well, we have to understand the connections between land and people. And so in that spirit, each speaker will make a brief land acknowledgement, and I'll start by saying that I'm here in Western South Dakota, which has been home to numerous Indigenous peoples over many thousands of years, but since treaty history and the local presence today is heavily Lakota, I'll acknowledge and thank Lakotas for allowing me to be a guest on this land. Each one of our speakers will have 8 to 10 minutes to introduce themselves and describe their work and project. Our panelists are going to try to screen share. Some of us have PowerPoint slides. We have Prezi. Some people are just going to talk. And I will do my best to give a 2-minute warning to each panelist. And if they go a little more than 10 minutes, I'll try to politely intervene and have them wrap it up so we stay on track. And so with that sort of math in mind, there's 6 of us. The panelist talks will take about an hour, and we hope the remaining 30 minutes become an open forum for questions and discussions. We had requested that this Zoom be a conference call format and not a webinar so that people can join visually and we have sort of an organic discussion at the end. But with that in mind, we ask, as Farina said, to please mute your microphones during the presentations and only unmute when you ask a question or make a comment at the end. And we also ask just to please use the Zoom chat and not the feed loop chat so we can consolidate questions and comments there. And Steve and I will do our best to keep track of those questions and facilitate and manage the discussion at the end. So thank you all very much for joining us. And I will go ahead and start with our first presenter, Angelo. And Angelo, take it away.
All right, well, thank you, everybody. I appreciate the opportunity to present today, and I'm really honored and, very grateful to be able to present on some of the work we've been doing here on the ground, and thanks for the invitation. I've been super busy lately because of course, all of the new administration things happening with national monuments, public lands, and of course the new Interior Secretary, Deb Haaland. So haven't had a good chance to really get down in there with you guys, but just very briefly, my introduction traditionally is in Navajo with all of my clans. So Yat A Angelo Baka Yinisha, Plashchit Nishlan, Kis Ani Bashichin, Twitchitni Dashiche, Akaidene Dashanella. So I'm Navajo and Hopi. I'm from the Bears Ears area. It's where I grew up. It's where I live. And it's both my personal and professional and educational lifelong projects there. So I'm a cultural resources coordinator for Utah Denebikea, doing a lot of work with the Indigenous-led conservation group there, trying to protect ancestral lands, Bears Ears and beyond. Doing a lot of community-based participatory research and film, so documentary film out of New York University. I'm also a PhD candidate in Department of Anthropology. So I'm almost done trying to finish my dissertation. But I wanted to start with this slide to show that there is a new community formation that's going on right now with having an intertribal coalition and an intertribal community that's building new social norms, mores, intersections, relationships, figuring out how to work with each other to protect their lands. And I think this is important to note because A lot of these tribes didn't get along historically, and some of them don't even get along right now. But I think this is why it's such an important effort to have these stories be told from the ground, from the community themselves, especially as it concerns history, public-facing information, and as we know, narrative development is increasingly crucial as that informs policy, legislation, and law. So issues of representation and self-representation are critical. What does that look like? How can you tell the difference? Why is it important to be able to tell the difference with these representations? And I think we prefer that self-representation is the best kind, because no one does a better job or knows those stories quite like the Native communities themselves. And I think that goes across narrative, textual, and of course, research representations. And I really love this representation here because it has the artist statement, this particular artist representation by Lee Sikakwaptewa, who is Navajo, Hopi, and Yakima. And what's so great about it is, one, this representation here is, it's accepted across the 5 tribes. There's no one has a problem with it. So there's consensus on the kind of solidarity and unification about having this cultural expression by somebody who's Indigenous, that has cultural awareness, competency, a background that informs his expression. So you can see it's the outline of the Bears Ears National Monument, the Obama designation, the 1.35 million acre one, but it's also a woman with a shawl dancing, holding a feather. So this is incredible because, you think about the layers that are in here. It's very important to have those representations from the people themselves. This would never be something that would be fostered by someone from the outside of the community, because they don't know about what these symbols and what the landscape means. So basically, from my perspective, I think the land acknowledgement is built into my introduction, because it gives the connection to my kinship, to my family, and also to the landscape itself. So Plashche is Red Bottom, and Red Bottom is my primary clan. So what it's referring to is the bottom of the red clay and the dirt, which is the Colorado Plateau, which is where Bears Ears is. So this is where I'm from. So I think essentially there's a disconnect for a lot of people who have trouble figuring out a land acknowledgement actually is within our clan introduction. So I know I just kind of went into that without doing the land acknowledgement, but in my personal opinion, like, that's tied into it, and that's my connection to this place. So going beyond that, it's a connection to many different tribes. So they all have different types of representations. So what we found was the media, and I'm using storytellers very broadly here, included the press, researchers, scholars, filmmakers, artists, anybody who was doing some kind of narrative description of Bears Ears. And what we were trying to figure out was how to make those narratives and representations better, because there is a lot of misrepresentation, especially when people don't know about the land, the people who are on that land, what tribal communities they come from. And so there's a tendency to default on stereotypes and tropes. But we made it mandatory for any of these reporting outlets who we had to train for our summer gathering. Once they come into the space of the community and they're taking photos and they're doing stories, we wanted them to have a media orientation and cultural sensitivity guide training. So these are a list of some of the folks that we trained already in person before we kind of let them loose out into the world. And some of the things that we wanted to do was correct incorrect spelling or mistake attribution on tribes, names, and clans. We wanted to make sure there were background and historical context for the tribes of the coalition. We wanted to stay away from derogative terms. We didn't want to call places ruins because that indicates that it's kind of decimated, when in actuality, these are ancestral villages, they're ancestral sites, and they're still very much alive. And we wanted to inform them that reciprocity, respect, cultural knowledge, and awareness of the current issues are key to their involvement with our community. So of course, and this is just a little portion and snippet, permissions are always good. You always want to get that clearance from parents, guardians, grandparents, and also don't record during ceremonies or prayers. These seem like standard basic stuff when we developed this. We're like, this is ridiculous. Nobody's going to need this. Everybody needed this. Everybody wanted it because no one ever tells them when they're in journalism school or when they're in high school or when they're even coming up in mainstream America, they have zero idea about cultural protocols in Native communities. Attribution is really important. You got to have the right names, labels, credit, and communities. Quite often our pictures are taken and they're not affiliated with anybody or any tribe. And if they are, it's often wrong. And also goes to the point where the people who take those photos get the credit. So we wanted to do some decolonial moves here and look at the place in the landscape without having those borders or the arbitrary lines of the maps, and understand that we all have a stake in that particular area that's sort of in the middle of where all the nations are at now and all the ancestral ties that go back to those places. So sort of getting out of the Western mind frame and thinking of a sort of decolonial way. And in the same thing, in terms of heritage, we use the Antiquities Act as a mechanism to leverage the monument status in our favor. But we also emphasize that traditional and Western knowledge are key. They supplement each other. So tangible heritage are often things that people think of like this, sites, places, materials, baskets, arrowheads, petroglyphs, and such. But the intangible heritage piece is just as important, if not more so, because you got to know who made those, who does it belong to, whose design is that, what were the songs that were sung in making all of that. And so it's important to have the involvement of the Indigenous communities. So when people talk about traditional knowledge, I always emphasize we need them both. We need to know who was there before you, what is the best stewardship practices of land management, what are the observational data over generations of an environment, the accumulated knowledge over long periods of time. So collaboration is the key. We want to do basic education. Not everyone has it. We want to make sure people know the difference between tribal sovereignty, federal policy, treaties, and we're learning to improve and work with each other. And the reciprocity piece is so important because as scholars, we know that it's been an extractive history. So the more generous that you are, the more generous that we will be as Native communities. And we honestly feel that the best is yet to come for stories, representations, and shared responsibilities in these ways, because we're really doing our best to figure out how to improve better practices. And I say better because there is no one best way. And every community is different, and we're constantly learning how to improve those practices. So this is, what I wanted to share with you today. And, hopefully this is a good intervention, a real-time intervention on the ground that people can implement in their own communities and figure out ways to improve those practices, working with folks inside and outside of their communities. So thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Angelo, and right on time. Thank you. So next up we have Riley. Riley, would you like to take over and introduce yourself?
Yes. Sorry, 1 second. Let me pull up my. Here we go. All right. So as you said, my name is Riley Hatch. And first of all, I wanted to as well give a land acknowledgement. I'm zooming in today from what is today Clearfield, Utah, but traditionally is Shoshone Bannock land. And I just want to thank first everyone on the roundtable. Thanks, Angelo, for your presentation. This is our first time meeting, but I just want to say I really enjoyed your chapter in decolonizing Mormonism. And I can't wait to hear from everybody else here as well. So in that vein, I'm going to try to keep my comments short because I feel like everyone has better things to talk about than I do. But when I was invited to this roundtable a while back, I honestly wondered whether or not I should accept for several different reasons. First, I've never been to NCPH, nor have I really thought about my research being public history at all. Second, I recently transitioned out of academia. Well, I mean, I'm still working on the dissertation, so soon, but I took a job teaching K through 12 history at the high school level. And while I know that most history is done outside of the academy, and NCPH is an amazing conference that illustrates just that, I still felt kind of uneasy because I'd been trained within that system. But then I realized that my transition to K through 12 teaching might be something that I could contribute to today's conversation about unerasing memory. So I took a job teaching American history at Davis High School in Kaysville, Utah last August. Teaching has always been my passion, and I was excited for the opportunity to spend all of my time in the classroom. But I was also kind of sad to leave my research behind. My dissertation focuses on the probably very ill-named Posey Wars, a series of violent episodes between Mormon settlers and Utes in 20th century southeastern Utah, actually in the exact same place that Angelo just talked about, in San Juan County, Utah. So, and I try to explore the differences and commonalities between Indigenous people and Mormon settlers as both groups negotiated the federal assimilation movements of the Progressive Era. Like others, I chose my project because it means something to me personally. As a white Mormon, I'm trying to come to terms with my faith's participation in settler colonialism. And this project is my feeble attempt at trying to right some previous wrongs, or at least to shed light on current injustices as well. But then I decided to move to teaching high school, and I assumed that my dissertation, if I finished it at all, would remain unpublished and unread by anyone other than maybe a few family members, if that. And I was totally fine with this. But I had the realization while I was creating lesson plans for the semester that being in the classroom with more than 200 students every day is an even more effective way to distill the ideas that I do explore in my dissertation, and that I probably shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Teaching high school gives me the opportunity to teach American history with an emphasis on Indigenous nations. And I can show my students, who otherwise might never have to consider Davis High School is 94% white, just so you know, might never have to consider the patterns of settler colonialism that either benefit or harm them, and the long and inequitable history of American imperialism, and how those trends have manifested locally in ways that affect them today, or at least maybe how they're participating within that system. I can invite my students to make connections between past events and present controversies and conflicts that spring from settler colonialism. And more importantly, being a teacher allows me to model and coach critical thinking skills so that my students can better be aware of the societal discourses that they consume, how those discourses came to be, and the methods by which they're distributed. And that allows them to be aware of their own discourse, giving them a freer hand at pursuing their intellectual curiosities, much like I did in my doctoral research. So at least that's the idea. These are 16-year-olds after all, right? But when I had this epiphany, I realized that teaching is public history. So how does that look in practice? How does the classroom become a site of unerasing Indigenous history? And how do I do that, especially as a white man? Well, it starts early and often, and it's more than just land acknowledgements, although that is also important, and I make sure to include that throughout the year, not just at the beginning of the year, but regularly as I'm teaching. Even though the class that I teach covers the entirety of United States history, we don't do halves, so I have to do the whole thing in 1 year. I make sure that the first week and a half is dedicated completely to Indigenous history, completely free from European entanglements. Reading backwards from Columbus negates historical contingency. And this is, if you get nothing else from my talk today, pedagogical transparency is the key here, right? Telling your students early and often why you're doing what you're doing. Letting the students know exactly why I've structured the material in a certain way, why they're engaging with certain assignments, and why they're reading certain articles. So speaking of readings, I make sure to assign articles on Indigenous history throughout the year, at least one per unit, and prioritizing those written by Native scholars. We discussed Michael Whitgan's discovery narrative, for example, when we did talk about Columbus, and probably going to use David Truer's section from his book where he talks about post-war termination programs. So for the material that they don't read as well, I make sure to incorporate that into my lecture material and cite it, right? For example, when we did the 1920s and 30s, I used Phil Deloria's Indians in Unexpected Places and made sure to give credit there. And again, pedagogical transparency is the key here. In regard to content, I prioritize Indigenous history in all aspects of American history. Too often in the narrative of the United States, and I tell this to my students, right? I say Native nations appear alongside Columbus, die off from disease, then disappear until the 1870s, then they kill Custer, and then they disappear after Wounded Knee. And instead, where we discuss Indigenous history throughout the entire course, and more than just the standard warriors, so the Tecumseh, Geronimo, Crazy Horse et al. And I tell them why I do that, right? Because remembering only those who fought against the United States plays into the inevitability of the discovery narrative and reinforces the vanishing Indian trope. Instead, we talk about survivance. We talk about the vast methodologies of resistance and perseverance that Indigenous peoples have utilized. For example, just last week, we covered the Great Depression and New Deal. And while, yes, we covered the stock market crash and the alphabet soup government programs and fireside chats, we spent the majority of our time in in-class discussion on the Indian Reorganization Act and Navajo stock reduction. They read Marcia Weisinger's article, we discussed it, and then we made connections between past and present tribal federal relationships, seeing how this story fit into the larger narrative. And we centered our conversation on sovereignty. And then we used the IRA to explore both the progress and dangers of the expanded federal power of the New Deal government. And then as a coda, we compared these issues of sovereignty and federal power to Bears Ears and Dakota Access Pipeline as well. And we had a great conversation of that. And I have a couple of written responses from students here, and I'm sharing these with permission. One student said, I really liked reading about the women and how they stood up for their families and were able to fight for their culture. It was heartbreaking to read how little effort went into, or from the people from the government trying to understand Navajo culture. If they would have taken the time to talk to the women and the people in charge of all the livestock, they could have avoided a lot of conflict. She goes on to say, it's really upsetting that I've never heard of this tragic event. Collier might have had good intentions, but he still didn't take the time to actually talk to the Navajo people and learn about what's important to them. And so I feel like this is a good example of a student internalizing those issues of sovereignty. I was going to discuss, teaching the Civil War and Reconstruction, but I'm going to cut that short. I will say this though, even though I only had 2 days to do the Civil War, but we spent one on the West. And I think that my students have a better understanding of the broader geopolitical forces of the Civil War era just by transparently helping them see the connections between the Fort Pillow Massacre and the Bear River Massacre, Andersonville Prison and Bosque Redondo Prison, and the thread of white supremacy that runs through both Jim Crow and the Dawes Act. So in conclusion, I firmly believe that the classroom is an ideal place to unerase Indigenous history. There are limitations, and I'm not saying that my students will remember every detail of our discussions, but I do dare to hope that their ability to critically engage with historical narratives and claims has increased, and that they will see that you can't understand American history without Indigenous history. So thank you.
Thanks, Riley. That was great. Steve, you're up next, but before you dive in, I just want to remind members of the audience, if you have a comment or question, you can, I believe, type it into the chat, and it's a good way to sort of begin jotting down thoughts for when the discussion comes. So go ahead, Steve.
All right, thank you very much. And thank you, Angelo and Riley. Those are some tough acts to follow right there. Those were both excellent and fascinating, I say, as I share my screen and get everything set up on my end. Okay. My name is Stephen Hausman. I'm an assistant professor in the history department at the University of St. Thomas. I want to thank all of my co-participants on this roundtable discussion today. I also want to congratulate Eric and his team for winning an honorable mention for their Rapid City Indian Boarding School lands project from the NCPH. It's a very well-deserved honor for a really tremendous project. So congratulations, Eric, and those who work with Eric. I also want to start today by saying that I'm coming to you all from Portland, Oregon, a city that sits on the lands of the Chinook, the Cathlamet, and the Wakiakum people. And my research is about Rapid City, South Dakota, which is a city which itself is on the lands of the Crow, the Cheyenne, and the Lakota nations. Yet, if to visit Rapid City, a white tourist might come away from a visit to Rapid City never knowing that they had visited a place with such a deep Native history. And this is not because history and memory are hard to find in Rapid City. Indeed, history and memory are everywhere in Rapid City. Memory sites are everywhere in Rapid. And Rapid City, indeed, it presents itself to the world as the city of monuments. You can see here that the city seal of Rapid, it proudly displays Mount Rushmore. The Pennington County Sheriff's Office also displays Mount Rushmore proudly across its seal. Mount Rushmore sits less than an hour's drive away from Rapid City in the nearby Black Hills. South Dakota as a state also situates Rushmore as the center of its identity identity on its license plates. So public memorialization in South Dakota and in Rapid City is very central to local identity. And monuments are truly everywhere in Rapid City. The city hails itself as not just the city of monuments, but the city of presidents as well. And practically every street corner bears a presidential statue. All 44 presidents up through President Obama are represented. And to answer the question that I'm sure many of you are thinking, yes, there are plans underway in Rapid City to include a statue of former President Trump in the city as well. Of course, monuments like these are myth and not history, but it's still instructive to consider just which versions of the city's past, which stories about this place are presented in Rapid City and which are ignored. This is an image of Founders Park, which is another such monumental mythic site of memory in Rapid, which bears, as you can kind of see on the ground there, bears a map of the original town site, as well as local history stories about Rapid's founding settlers. And Founders Park sits on the banks of Rapid Creek, the waterway that flows through the center of downtown Rapid. You can kind of see it in the background there. Rapid Creek is small by the standards of a river, but it's large for a creek. And Rapid Creek has played an outsized role in the city's history, never more so than on the night of June 9th, 1972, when a huge thunderstorm wrecked a dam that sat upstream from Rapid City on Rapid Creek, which caused a massive flood, which ended up killing nearly 250 people. The 1972 Rapid City flood, which is at the center of my larger project, was a textbook example of environmental racism. From the 1930s until the 1960s, many Native people living in Rapid City lived in a neighborhood along Rapid Creek known as Oshkosh, or sometimes known as Oshkosh Camp. So-called because it was adjacent to Oshkosh Street in Rapid City. And Native people living in Oshkosh faced discrimination on several different fronts. Their housing stock was poor, described by one person who lived there as tar paper shacks. It often lacked running water and other city services, despite being less than a mile from downtown Rapid City. Landlords and real estate agents in the city would typically not rent or sell to Native people throughout the rest of the city, limiting them to residing in Oshkosh or one of the few and often equally neglected federal housing projects which were built in the city in the 1950s. So because whites in Rapid City, because white people in Rapid City refused to rent or sell property by and large to Native citizens in the city outside of a few selected areas, Rapid City's Native population lived largely in temporary and transient housing on the eve of the 1972 flood. And it's not clear how extensive the Oshkosh neighborhood was by the early 1970s. Some sources indicate that it had been removed in the 1960s. Others indicate that it still existed. And I personally believe that it was likely a decentralized neighborhood by then. It had spread sort of from this concentrated space to other areas along Rapid Creek. But in any of these cases, Rapid City had a housing crisis in the early 1970s, one that predominantly affected Rapid's poorer population, who resided mostly in areas close to Rapid Creek, often in trailer homes and in transient housing. And to be poor in Rapid City in the 1970s often meant also being Native. And these factors all meant that when Rapid Creek overran its banks on the night of June 9th, 1972, it was Native people who faced the greatest degree of danger, and indeed close to 25%, between 20 and 25% of all of those who perished that night were Native in a city whose population was 90% white. The memory of the 1972 flood very understandably looms large in Rapid City. It remade the city in multiple ways. In the flood's aftermath, the city government, awash in relief funds, turned the creek's floodplain into a long green space called the Greenway, which winds its way through the center of Rapid City today and was designed to ensure that people would no longer live directly in the creek's floodplain. Never again became a watchword in the city's flood memory. Yet as much as Rapid promised never again, many of the factors that led to the disaster's inequalities are indeed repeating again today. And this is because while some elements of the flood are not to be forgotten, others have indeed been forgotten. In all settler spaces, including Rapid, some memories loom larger than others, which brings me back to the history of monuments and memorialization in Rapid City. Because today, Founders Park sits, and I'll go back to my slide of Founders Park here. Founders Park today sits where the old Oshkosh neighborhood had once existed. There's no marker or memorial to the Native victims of the flood or to the neighborhood which once sat where today this marker of the city's white founders sits. And I would argue that this is in fact no accident. This is by design. Now, to be perfectly clear, no marker or no memorial will bring back the lives of those who died in the flood or would reconstruct a destroyed neighborhood, but public memorials help give meaning to a space. They tell stories about what places represent. And Rapid City, with its monumental architecture of presidents, both on its street corners and looming nearby in the shape of Mount Rushmore, tells a settler story. At Founders Park, a person can learn about the settlers who founded this place on the banks of Rapid Creek and then drive an hour away to Mount Rushmore and can learn the broader meaning of that founding, that it was in service of extending American ideals of freedom and liberty into the American West, or so the story goes. But of course, Indigenous stories fit uncomfortably into this kind of celebratory narrative of settlement and expansion. And rather than grapple with these more difficult histories, settlers have instead sought to erase them. Indeed, they're trying to erase Native people from Rapid's urban space entirely. White settlers in Rapid City have attempted this erasure through several different means. In the mid-20th century, it was through housing and employment discrimination. When the city finally accepted federal funding to build a housing development specifically for the city's Native community in the 1950s, white city officials insisted on building that housing development just over city limits, literally rejecting the very idea of Native space existing within the bounds of Rapid City. And the 1972 flood only heightened this atmosphere of attempted erasure. Native flood survivors who lost property or family members received far less money than their white neighbors in relief funds. And again, this was by design. Relief loans went primarily to homeowners rather than to renters. And in Rapid, where racist housing policies ensured that the vast majority of Native residents rented rather than owned homes, this meant that despite representing a disproportionately large number of flood victims, Native people received a disproportionately small amount of flood relief money. One contemporary study from the 1970s found that only $1.3 million of the nearly $100 million in relief money that came into Rapid after the flood in total went to Native Rapid Cityans, about 1.5% of the total. Out of a Native flood victim population of 20 to 25%. So the goal of the settler city in the wake of the flood was not to allow Rapid's Native community to rebuild itself, but rather to continue this attempted erasure from the city's demography and from the city's history. And this process carries forth into the memorialization of the flood itself. At both the 20th and the 40th anniversary commemoration events, Native people and Native stories played a very small role in these public memory-making ceremonies. And the 50th anniversary, as the 50th anniversary commemoration events come over the horizon in 2022. And I say this as someone who's been involved somewhat in the planning, I have sincere doubts about whether this anniversary will be any different, whether commemorators will make any effort, white commemorators will make any effort to tell a new story about the flood. But the silences created by the settler city of Rapid go even deeper. In conducting research for the book project I'm working on, the city and state archives contain virtually no references to the city's Native population. And when pressed on this, city officials will often claim that they were simply thrown away. Of course, Native people were never actually erased from this place that has always been Native space. And this ongoing attempted erasure, the fact that it is a continuing attempted process is a testament to its failure as a process. Today, Rapid City is a major hub of Indigenous activism. When former President Trump flew into Rapid City for a visit to Mount Rushmore for a speech last summer in 2020, there was Indigenous activists from Rapid City and other nearby towns who faced arrest in protesting his arrival. Nick Tilson, who is the president of the Native activist group, the Indian Collective, was thrown in a Rapid City jail for his part in the protests. Yet even stories of erasure, however untrue, have material implications. Today, Rapid City is approximately 70% white and 25% Native, yet Native people make up the majority of the city's homeless population, a population described in 2018 by white Rapid City Council member Richie Nordstrom as, quote, the undesirables, language of exclusion and erasure even still. Again, claiming that Native people don't belong in this space that has always been Native space. So as I conclude, as long as Rapid City's public memory sites like Mount Rushmore, sites like Founders Park are devoted to settler stories, so too will powerful settler politicians and policymakers like Nordstrom think, speak, and act based upon those narratives. The results of telling stories of exclusion and erasure are Rapid City in 1972 and Rapid City today. To change the city, we need to change the interpretive frameworks that exist throughout the community, the stories that are made most accessible through public memory spaces, the story that Rapid City tells about itself most publicly. And I will wrap up there. Thank you all very much. And Farina, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. So I'm going to use what I have if you have me on speaker view, you could see some of my live Prezi presentation here. But so I decided I would talk about COVID-19 oral histories in a project that I'm working now, inspired by Dene Doctor History, an open syllabus connected to my website. But I will introduce myself in Dene Bazad. She'e bilagana nishle do kiya ani bashishchin bilagana dashache do sinajini dashanale akot egot sa nishle. And I recognize in that, I appreciate Angelo explaining, how our clans and where we come from, it's connected to land. And I am of white settler descent on my mother's side. She's from white English Americans who settled in Michigan. And I am born for the Towering House clan and the Blackstreet Woods people. So, Blackstreet Woods, again, it tells us where we're coming from, and that can tell if I'm related, to Angelo and other Dene kin or individuals here. It also carries that kinship connections with land and where we're coming from. And, this is indigeneity that we carry with us, and it's something I explore in a lot of my my work of experiences of Native Americans, especially Dene, going to boarding schools like Intermountain Indian School, or boarding schools even within Dene Bikeya. Sorry, Dene Bikeya. I'm working on my Navajo within the Navajo Nation, and I've worked with always trying to draw connections with all the circles that I am tied to or connected to, whether it is, as Riley said, the students that we teach, involving them. And I teach general US history courses as well. And I always try to center and intertwine Native American Indigenous histories. And I'm currently on a project at my University of Northeastern State University, where I work as an assistant professor and a director for a center of Indigenous community engagement, that and here as well of Northeastern State University was founded by the Cherokee Nation after the forced removal of the Trail of Tears. And through the flux, and often what everyone's talking about here, the complicated histories of that have often been intentionally erased, distorted in large dominating narratives being pushed through American schools, that Cherokee peoples who came and replanted, rerouted and developed, started to build their homes here in what would for them be Cherokee Nation, Jalagi, and later the state of Oklahoma, was the ancestral homelands of Osage, who were forcibly removed and pushed, and all these dynamics, right, happening. So I explore and work with various Indigenous communities, and our students, though we were founded by the Cherokee Nation as a Cherokee National Female Seminary in the 1850s, our school later was sold, but under allotment and the pushes of disintegrating and absorbing the Cherokee Nation, was sold to the state of Oklahoma. So there's this complicated relationship even with the institution I'm affiliated with, and that affects my work of I'm now working on a committee addressing a monument of forgiveness that was done by a non-native artist, and the issues there, and how it's appropriating, as Angelo brought up, questions of representation, self-representation. I'm working with my institution of how do we, as Marcia said, who I honor and respect as well, how do we not just do land acknowledgement as trendy, but really use it to have public education? So various projects I'm involved in. I'm involved in an Indigenous history and literacy project, working with K through 12 educators about how to focus on Indigenous sources in the classroom. So this topic there's a lot I could say, and in just 8 minutes, I appreciate my colleagues and I'm doing the best I can to jump into it. But I wanted to be sure to focus on and bring up the project I'm working on now of basically contextualizing and carrying voices of my family, especially my father, Philip Smith, who is a physician in Navajo Nation and has worked for the Indian Health Service for many years. It's my connection to him that has really affected the way I think about health. And he was in Navajo Nation Monument Valley when the outbreaks of COVID-19 hit. And how do we all process and think about the impacts of COVID-19, but especially, the disproportionate impact on Black, Indigenous people of color, and especially on my kin and Navajo Nation. How do we understand that? And then how do we talk and teach and share that? And it's tied to this issue. It's tied to this issue of, gonna jump due to time. It is tied to this issue of erasure of memories. And what I'm going to start with is, this is a picture of my father, Philip Smith, and he was a physician who worked in Navajo Nation in different clinics and Indian Health Service. And that's from a Deseret News article in the 1980s. And in the article that I found and was reading, the writer is saying, oh, it's so dire, the health condition. Dr. Smith is having to work in all these clinics. A mother who's having a pregnancy complication, how can she get to the emergency room? There's all these, it's unequal, what do you call it? The disparities in healthcare in Navajo Nation. And it's decrying this, it's bringing this out, exposing these issues. And that's in the 1980s. And it really hit me that that picture, has been very powerful and inspirational for my family. This is an image that my niece, Leah Tiare Smith, did of that. And this image as well. She did these pieces. And what was, I think, upsetting to me is that we have gone really far in a lot of ways, but then if people ask that question, which I've heard many times, of why does COVID-19, why has it hit Navajo Nation so hard? Or why is it affecting these peoples in these ways? That shows, the erasure of the memories and the histories, and they're not aware of all these ongoing issues, that it's interconnected. And so that inspired me to try to develop an open syllabus, and also even projects I do with my students. Most of them are not Navajo. I do work with some Diné students. Most are Cherokee or Muskogee, Choctaw, from different peoples around here. And we have one of the highest populations of Native American students in the country, and graduate them. So I had a project recently that my students are doing of connecting with our university archives. And I give students the option, they can opt out of having this piece go to the archives, but I ask them if it's okay to have this piece go to the archive. And what I ask them to do is reflect on their COVID-19 experiences. And also even compare that, it's in a US history as well. I might ask them to think about 1918 influenza pandemic, for example. And one of the first submissions was from a student who is Osage, is of Indigenous peoples here. And it was really powerful to read of his experience, how he's navigating it, how his family, what kin meant to him, and the connections he has. So as I'm working, on these projects of trying to educate people about contextualizing COVID-19 in Navajo Nation, and tracing that through different times, all the way to, and these are just different key parts of the website if you explore it. But tying it as well to oral tradition, how Diné have been the language my relatives have been using, and what we hear, and ways of understanding this. It was interesting because in a book called Yellow Dirt by Jody Pasternak, for example, she talked about monsters and brought up the oral tradition of monsters. And you see here a quote from Sunny Dooley from an article that she talks about COVID-19 as monsters. And the reference to the monsters and the framework of that kind of language and dynamic, it's referring to oral tradition of such as the twin heroes and how they would go and confront and face different monsters, including the one depicted in that image. And there were some monsters still left remaining from the twin heroes. I know I'm paraphrasing and rushing through all this, so I'm not really giving it the full intricacy that it involves. But I think it's this concept of how the monsters that continue to plague humankind, humanity, they can be described as, yes, disease, but also like negativity, greed, negative forces, lust or laziness, all these kind of things it can tie to. And so it's also this connection when talking to people of how they see this disease affecting them, yes, in physical ways, but also affecting them in these very mental, spiritual ways. And as everyone's talking about here, there are these different dynamics in the history of where Native American peoples have been targeted, have been poisoned through even educational means of removing children from their families and beating, the identity of trying to cut off their ties to land and what it means or what their families mean to them. And that's a story very much of my father, who was sent away when he was 5 years old to a boarding school. And in that school, whatever happened there, a sense of belittling his language, his culture. And this is a quote from my father about, as I've talked a lot about this project with him and just right now conversations with my kin, I'm working towards other projects of how to share these voices in a following protocol, following a respectful way. But something my father said, talking to him recently, was when you're healthy, there's harmony and good balance of things. And something my cousin said too was, he said, you have to want to survive, was something he shared recently. To survive, you must want to survive. I'm going to jump ahead because I'm supposed to wrap up already. I'm sorry. Thank you so much for your patience. But lastly, with all this, the work that I'm trying to do is draw connections, especially to my family, even people like my father, his story, like it comes that personal, of even my father, his story of being a young boy who was born in a hogan in an area where I recently found this out from COVID-19, talking to him about COVID-19. I recently found out that my father was born in a hogan on a land that his family was removed from because uranium mining was happening right on around that land and contaminating the waters. So his family was removed from the place where the hogan where he was born. And I later, connect that to his experience of going to boarding school, his interests in medicine, in health, how his father was hatafle and trying to teach him, medicine ways of Navajo people. And then, to the point where he's a 70-year-old doctor in Monument Valley with the outbreaks and all the anxieties of COVID-19 that I'm sure all of us can relate to in some way or another. And how he's trying to navigate this. And it's tied, to these intergenerational stories, not only my father, but through the kin that I introduced myself before, through, my ancestors and my relatives and all these dynamics. And how do we, share our own stories, and how I'm trying to help my students, find their voices and do that, to carry it in a way that helps us all to defeat the monsters that we face and to survive them, but not just survive them, but grow and thrive as a people, which we also see, in the beauty of so much beauty I've seen among my relatives, my kin in responses and through the COVID-19 pandemic. Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry I went so over. Thanks.
That's okay. Thanks, Farina. Darren.
Yeah, thank you for having me. My name is Darren Perry. I'm the former chairman of the Northwestern Band of Shoshone Nation. The beautiful Cache Valley, where I reside today, is the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Northwestern Band of Shoshone Nation. I reside on lands ceded in the 1863 treaty at Fort Bridger. Today, though, I want to recognize Utah's 8 federally recognized Native nations, historic Indigenous communities that reside in Utah, Indigenous individuals and communities that live here now, and those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. In offering this brief land acknowledgement, I affirm Indigenous sovereignty, history, and experiences. American history for a long time was written and taught as a single story. It's a national success story celebrating human triumphs made possible in a society based on principles of liberty and equality, or so we thought. In years past, historians sometimes ignored or dismissed those whose experiences didn't always conform to this master narrative. Often dismissed were the experiences of the American Indian. After all, our story is one of decline and suffering rather than one of progress and happiness. When our story was told, it was usually portrayed as one futile resistance to the march of civilization. Images of savage warriors attacking settlers became firmly fixed in popular concepts of the past, well documented by Hollywood. But times change, and the history and the stories that we tell about the past and how we understand them changes too. Understanding the past involves looking at history from the viewpoints of many people who have made it over the centuries. American Indians must be included as a central strand in the history of the United States. Our historical experiences require us to look beyond the stereotypes and rethink some basic assumptions that we've had about history and how we memorialize those stories from the past. It's human nature to believe that our story is the story. The danger, though, of carrying that view is that we become calcified in our own echo chambers and we stay insulated in groups that parrot back our own confirmed biases. I have come to realize over a lifetime that when we reduce history to just data, and when we remove the emotional or the storytelling side of history, we lose some of the humanity that makes history so important. And that's why our story is so important. Here in the beautiful Cache Valley lies the site of one of the worst massacres of Native American in the history of the US. For years, many gathered on January 29th to remember the events of that morning. From 1932 to 2001, this memorial was attended by a handful of Native Americans from various tribes, curious folk from nearby towns, local historians, news reporters, officials from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Strangely absent, though, was members of the Northwestern Band of Shoshone Nation, my people. All of that changed, though, more than 20 years ago when we were able to acquire 35 acres of that sacred site. In 2018, we again purchased an additional 700 acres. This began a journey to tell our story from our perspective. When Patrick Edward Connor and his command of California volunteers from Camp Douglas, Utah, attacked a sleeping Indian village on the early morning hours of that day, he controlled for a time what was to be remembered, but not anymore. Have you ever had a memory sneak out of your eye and roll down your cheek? I have that all the time when I remember the experiences of my people at the massacre at Bo Ogai. Just north of Preston, Idaho today, there's an old monument just off of Highway 91. This monument was erected in 1932 by the people of Franklin County. It was meant to tell the story of the events of that day. What the monument really accomplished for me is that it gave people a reason to forget. That monument strips us of our obligation to find out for ourselves what actually took place. And that monument always tells us how it wants the past to be remembered. My good friend David Lewis said that humans have great memories for what they want to remember. In commemorating this battle, you forget the uglier parts of history and you focus on the heroism of the soldiers and the saints. And that's the kind of Daughters of Utah Pioneers monument that exists there today. It's not a story about the Shoshone people. It becomes a story about the brave soldiers and the pioneer women who took care of them. In constructing this monument, you firm up memory and you create history. One of the problems with the monument that exists there today for me is that it really gives us one point of view from one generation's perspective, 69 years after the actual event. It's like a view from a window that has been carefully placed to exclude a whole quadrant of a beautiful landscape. You only get to see what they want you to see. It also reinforced the view that Indians were savages, and it went so far as to label our women and children as enemy combatants. It reinforces the view that violence on the frontier was necessary for the survival of Mormon communities, and showed what the consequences would be if both groups tried to share the same space. What if one of those plaques on that monument had been written from the perspective of the Northwestern Shoshones? Would it have read the same? Maybe it would have said this: the massacre of the Northwestern Band of Shoshones occurred in this vicinity on January 29th in 1863. Colonel Patrick Edward Connor and his command of California Volunteers attacked a sleeping Indian village on the early morning hours of the day. The soldiers shot, raped, bludgeoned, and bayoneted several hundred men, women, and children to their death. The Indians fought back with the limited weapons that were available to them, but the band was all but annihilated. So which version of the massacre is correct? The answer will always lie in your perspective. Tell me a fact and I will learn. Tell me a truth and I will believe. But tell me a story and it will live in my heart forever. Again, David Lewis said, ultimately, the story of the Bear River Massacre is their story. And in some ways, I hope that we can all respect the story that they want to have told, as well as recognize our role in that story. History doesn't always affirm us. Sometimes history challenges us to think about an uglier past that we'd rather not have. But that's really the power and the benefit of history. It connects us to the past. It connects us to our humanity and our inhumanity. And it offers us a way to move forward, especially in a circumstance like this with the Shoshone people, moving forward in a story that connects us not in the prettiest of ways, but to move forward to a new relationship that is a 21st century relationship, one based on respect. Respect for the truth, what happened in that past moment. That is when you get the possibility for reconciliation. The reality of finally being able to tell our story from our perspective is powerful. The purchase of the massacre site will help us reconnect to a sacred space. Voices that have been quiet for a long time are now being heard. Collaborative efforts between us and the community and Utah State University will help us bring back what has been lost forever. But as important as the preservation of those stories and our people, what is equally as important is the restoration of that beautiful land, returning that earth to what Mother Nature intended. We are now just beginning to take that back, that narrative. And this is our story and we will be heard. Oh, Great Spirit, whose voice I hear in the winds, and whose breath gives all to the world, hear me. Thank you very much for allowing me to share my thoughts.
Thank you, Darren. And I'm up next for our last presentation. I just wanted to let everybody know we have about 30 minutes left of the session, and I want to make sure we have robust discussion. So if you have questions or comments, please either get ready to share them or type them into the chat and we can do that. And just to try to preserve as much room for discussion as possible, but also because Steve's presentation sort of teed me up really well. I'm going to do kind of a truncated version of my talk so we can get into the discussion, if that's okay. Can everybody see my screen and also my mouse moving around here? Can you see that? All right. So I want to jump ahead and just say, again, it's Eric Zimmer. I'm a historian from Rapid City, South Dakota, the same place where Steve did his presentation on. It's been a pleasure, working with him and getting to know his scholarship throughout this the project that he's working on and the one that I'm working on. So I should also say at the outset that the Rapid City Indian Boarding School Lands Project is a Indigenous-led community research and volunteer advocacy project here in Rapid City. There's about 25 core members, and we have another group of about 100 community members who have volunteered in various ways over the last couple of years. I am only one cog in this much larger wheel, and I've done what I can to contribute my skill set to help tell this story and bring it to the fore. And I hope I do justice to all the Native and non-Native people who have put this work together over the last 8 years or so. And so again, just to sort of give you a really quick overview, the image you have is an aerial shot of Rapid City, which Steve was talking about a few minutes ago. And the base map that you see behind it with the dots on there is actually from the University of Virginia's racial dot map, which is a project, I don't know if anybody's familiar with it, but they basically use census tract data to be able to show urban segregation in any community in Rapid City. So all the little blue dots that you see on here are essentially representative of white, predominantly white census tracts, and the little darker, I think they're brown dots, are Native people in Rapid City. And one of the things that you see immediately is that the Native community in Rapid City, that's what this dotted line to the right outlines, the Native community in Rapid City is very heavily consolidated in the downtown and north parts of the city. And not coincidentally, because of systemic racism and broader issues that we don't have time to discuss today, those also tend to be the most disadvantaged neighborhoods in Rapid City and have been for many decades. And this project that I'll go into in just a second has begun to unearth a lot of that. You may recall a few minutes ago when Steve was talking about the greenway that runs through the middle of town. That's why there's these white strips that run through, or sort of blank strips through town where there's nobody living. The creek runs right through the middle of the city and kind of divides it in that way. And so this sort of has a way of separating people on the land. The Founders Park / Oshkosh Village that Steve was talking about is this little blue rectangle in the middle, right in the middle of downtown. And then you might recall from his presentation that there was a couple of neighborhoods founded in 1954. That's the Sioux edition, which is this one here. And then another neighborhood that was added on to it in the late 1960s as the community grew, called Lakota Homes. And so part of what our project is really about is understanding the connections between this big red oblong thing on the left, which is the land of the former Rapid City Indian School, to the dismantling and destruction of the Oshkosh camp in the 1950s, to the creation of these neighborhoods on the north side, and ultimately to the decision making and clear processes that have segregated the Native community to the north part of Rapid City. To just move really quickly through a background of how our project got started, 8 years ago, a group of Native women in Rapid City, elders, told some friends of mine to quote unquote find the graves. And what they were talking about was the graves of Native children who died at the Rapid City Indian School, which was a federal boarding school. I won't go into the history of that. I'm sure people are generally familiar with it. But the boarding school operated from 1898 to 1933 before becoming a civilian conservation corps camp in the Depression, and then becoming an Indian Health Services hospital after that, and a tuberculosis clinic in between. So somewhere on this vast campus that covers over 1,200 acres on a big portion of what is now the west side of Rapid City, as you saw on my slide a moment ago, was all land that belonged to the school. So as my colleagues began doing a parcel by parcel search for where these graves were, not only did we identify the names of many children who died at the school using archival sources like the one on the right, which are blurry and faded and very difficult to read. In many cases, the BIA agents did not inform families of what happened to the children when they died at the school. And in some cases, they didn't even bother to record their name. They just wrote infant, died, date, right? And so our work started first as a way to find the graves, second as a way to collect the names of these children and send them to their the descendants who have gone generations now without really knowing what happened to them. And then thirdly, as we have done this work, we have started to piece together how not only did the children's graves get lost and erased, and not only was this all sort of connected to these broader patterns of segregation that I talked about, but there was actually a very spurious set of land transactions that took place in the 1940s. So as Rapid City was undergoing the post-war housing boom that Steve talked about, people in Rapid City got together. They got Congress to pass a law in 1948 that basically allowed the Department of the Interior to deed away all this land on the west side of Rapid City. And of the various entities who were eligible to receive land under that law, quote unquote needy Indians, which was the term of art used at the time to talk about how this native land for the boarding school should go to the members of the native community in Rapid City. Not a single square inch of this 1,200 acres went to the native community. So for the last 8 years, we have been doing all sorts of work to research, publish, do education and outreach to inform the community about this history and raise awareness about it. As part of that work, we got the City Council last November to approve a resolution acknowledging this history and the ugly aspects of it, but also committing $20 million worth of land and resources to begin the process of capitalizing a for-profit entity that would support the operations of a Native Community Center, which currently does not exist in Rapid City. So that's a huge step. We are also in the process of developing a children's memorial on that hillside you saw on one of my earlier slides is actually where the graves are. We did locate them, and we're in the process of working with native and non-native sculptors and artists and raising funds to be able to turn that hillside into an interpretive campus that protects and memorializes the children who died there and tells the story of the school. And then we are also, as I mentioned, sort of working on these broader land exchange issues with the city to figure out how to begin the process of returning property and having a sort of make good. And again, I'm trying to move quickly here. Our project is called Remembering the Children. You can go to rememberingthechildren.org to learn more about this history and to learn more about this broader initiative. And then the last thing I wanted to say is just that, one of the really powerful things is that every October on Indigenous Peoples Day, we have a memorial march that goes from where the boarding school headquarters was, the Indian Health Service Hospital, all the way to where the graves are. And we have children, in many cases, the descendants or relatives of the children who died at the school carry plaques with their names, and they walk and honor those children on the way up. So it is a big, expansive, complicated history and a big, expansive, complicated project, but one that I think is really meaningful, and I'm just really honored to be a part of. So with that, I will stop and give a moment of pause to thank all of the presenters for your excellent work and presentations, and the audience for being here. And then I will try to open it up to questions. Did anybody have a question or comment they wanted to start off with?
Eric, I did want to mention, thanks for your presentation and your work, and everyone on the panel. It's been wonderful and such an honor always to hear from all of you. I know some of us, we've heard from each other before, we've been on panels before, but I always learn something new. It's remarkable. So I really appreciate you all taking the time. But Eric, your presentation especially does, I wish Marsha could be here, but it especially connects to her work with using sonar, radar, and different technologies to also find missing children who were buried at Chamawa Indian School and her work there. So I do hope in the future we can connect again, and wanted to mention that for those who are unfamiliar with Marsha Small's work too, and the efforts at various boarding schools of how do we, how do we recognize the children and find the children and connect them to families, and also what's happened even at Carlisle Institute of even bringing children home and different efforts there. So I appreciate you sharing that, and wanted to be sure to mention Marcia as well as a part of these. It's happening, the different works that are happening throughout areas and communities, but possible connections.
That's great. Thanks for the comment, Farina. Can I ask a member of the audience to come alive, as it were, and ask us a question or provide an insight?
Yes, please do. This is why we wanted to be sure we were not just doing the webinar style. We'd love to hear you and see from you. I know some people are doing dishes while listening or running, who knows? And we appreciate as well, thank you to those for putting in some of the links in the chat, such as like to my website. I shared one of the website for Darren's Bogi. Maybe I'll look up as well other links that can be helpful for people. That's there. Sometimes people are thinking.
I know all of our talks were not that self-explanatory.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Well, I had some questions to kind of bring this up. Is I'm wondering, with this idea of unerasing memory, maybe, and what I've heard from each of you, what do you feel like when I thought in terms of coming to this session, I wanted to think about also what kind of, I don't know, it seems like it's an active process, right? There's some conferences where you give a presentation and you just talk about what you did or what you've been doing, like it's more descriptive, or it's like a report or something. But I felt like this session is actually very, each of you kind of inspire me more of, wow, I've got to check this out. I've got to do this, So if in a nutshell, and I felt like as I was preparing this, I wanted to be, and I know it was really hard in 8 minutes, but I wanted to, and it's not that the word prescriptive is the word, but really like how it's more than just, all right, I'm listening, I hear you, but now what? What would you recommend, or what do you often find yourself recommending to people in terms of, because some folks will call it activism, but I feel like for many Indigenous communities and folks we're working with and connected to, this isn't activism, this is living. Like it's like people trying to live and not be stamped out or disconnected, even in these different issues. So I don't know if there's something, each of you, how you articulate that, and all the different, when often people say, they might phrase it as, how can I be an ally, or what can I do, but I do think in whatever way people articulate that question or comment, what have you said? Because sometimes I wonder too, here I am in the elevator with someone, and what do I say in a minute, or how do I express it? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on your comment there, Farina, because I do think that it's too often in these conferences, in these academic spaces, that people can just kind of absorb that information and there's not so much interaction. I feel like the best learning is really having the interaction and understanding where the gaps in knowledge are. So what I've discovered is when we do these trainings, a lot of people have difficulty owning their ignorance, wanting to know, but not knowing how to ask a question. And I think the more educated of the folks that we go up the ladder, the harder that is. No one wants to say, oh, I don't know. They just want to present themselves as if they know all the answers, unfortunately. But, I think history is increasingly becoming a contact sport, guys. We have to think of this as public facing, and, thinking about this work is not exactly easy to do. Like a lot of this content is very heavy. And, that is the lived reality of a lot of us. unfortunately. And so I really loved what I think it was what Darren said, that we can't just be in our own echo chambers and just talk to regular constituencies that we're familiar with. So I've been taking this training across different groups as well, with conservation groups, nonprofits, academics, scholars, filmmakers, a lot of different people who bring different questions, and folks who have like a fresh slate and don't have preformed or preconditioned notions of the different ways that we might have already engaged these ideas. So I just want to also give a shout out to Darren and his family, because I had done a short documentary with one of the elders there, May Perry, and talked about that Bear River Massacre with her. She was a genuine delight, so reminds me much of my grandmother. So just wanted to acknowledge that, so thank you very much for all the hard work that you guys are doing. It's not easy, it's very difficult. And it's even harder to find out new pathways to healing in our contemporary day, and then thinking about the next generations to come.
Thanks, Angelo. Darren, I see your mute's off. Did you want to make a comment?
No, hey, thank you for that as well, Angelo. She was my grandmother, and she practically raised me. So all of my work points to her, and then a continuation of what she does. But what I found really helpful for me is it's okay to talk about hard, heavy things, as long as when you're engaging with the communities that we work in, and it's important to me to get buy-in from all communities. But as we talk about those hard things, I don't leave it there. I use it as a springboard to how can we take tragedies from the past and hard things and make a difference in the future. So what can we do together as different communities of color? How can we come together to make the future and the community we're going to live in and our grandkids are going to live in, how can we make that better? And what I found is they allow me enough rope to talk about hard things, and many of their relatives were the perpetuators of these hard things. But as I always bring it back to, as long as we acknowledge, we can begin the healing process, but now let's work together to make a better future for all of us. So what is our story going to look like going forward with you? And how can we make a difference in our communities today? And I think as long as that's our goal and that's the message, I think it's much more easier for people that have been on the other side to accept and embrace. So that's all I wanted to add.
That's great. Thanks, Darren. Steve, you unmuted too. What did you have to share?
Well, to Darren's point, and again, I want to thank everyone for joining today. That was really it was wonderful hearing all of your scholarship and your insights. But to Darren's point, as a white scholar who is working on stories that are sometimes from white settlers, but are often from Native people, it took a lot of me shutting up and being humble often, in order to tell these stories. So I remember when I went to Rapid City one of the first times, I, just informally met with a lot of Native contacts, people who knew people who were willing to just come and talk with me. And it took a lot of me sitting back and letting people kind of guide how I was going to do this project. People telling me, tell the story this way, not that way. The big thing that I heard repeatedly was, don't tell this story as pure tragedy. If you're going to tell the story of this flood and include the native community in this flood story, don't tell it as a story of just, this, things were bad, a bad thing happened and things got worse, right? Because that's not the lived experience of people that were actually living in Rapid City itself. And it's much more complicated than that. And, that was, I will admit, originally how I was kind of telling that story. So again, as a white scholar, it means taking a step back, shutting your mouth and listening and letting what you hear kind of guide the way that you're telling these stories.
Those are great insights for everybody. I did see that we have 3 very brave audience members who turned on their cameras. I didn't quite see who got on first, but I see that your hand's up. Is it Priya?
Yeah, I really, some of this is just echoing what Steve said and what Angelo mentioned. Hi, Angelo. Angelo, I've basically, I work with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and listening to, I've had the opportunity to work with Angelo in the past, and then working on a presentation in 2019 with Ada Deer from the Menominee tribe. And now I work with Micah Group, and I will say at every step of the way, I have learned more about how to work with your communities, and I really appreciate all of you taking the time. And Darren, last night, your presentation, especially sharing your stories, because I think that the more we talk to different individuals doing this work about their own history and their own past, the more that we as practitioners can learn about how we can be better at this work. And I think that I just wanted to say thank you. It's not so much a question, but it's especially that emphasis on personal storytelling and how it's emotional in the work we do underscores basically all of our work with underrepresented histories, and that we need to acknowledge that very personal nature in a way that a lot of it's just hard for people who come out of academia and stuff to do, because it's not factual or it's not in a book. And I believe that that vulnerability and keeping yourselves open to that is really helpful, even though I know it is hard. So thank you.
Thank you very much. RJ, I think you were on. Did you want to make a comment?
Well, similarly, it's a very ill-formed thought, but it's an idea that comes through a lot of what it strands through everyone, but particularly something that Darren said in his presentation, and really like the pedagogy that Riley is using. Darren had mentioned, he sort of described the Utah Pioneers Monument maybe generously as one perspective. And just one thing that I've been struggling with as a non-Native person engage with Indigenous ways of knowing and Indigenous histories is like, how long our field has allowed the word history to be defined as sort of like the story of what happened, so long as I can still feel good about myself at the end, and how that's just sort of like not necessarily done in good faith. So I just struggle with like how these empowerment and Indigenous storytelling and ways of telling history are really teaching our field that like we've had kind of a messed up definition for so long, maybe not in the last 10, 15 years, but just if you want to reflect on that or, shut down that thought.
Actually, that reminds me that this semester I started my history classes with Imavar's op-ed. I think it was in the Washington Post, that basically it was like, history shouldn't be patriotic. They shouldn't be patriotic because it was the argument about just what you brought up of his critique of how people say, well, if it's negative, just forget about it, put it away. And to be honest, that's not just a European American approach to history in a way. Like I've heard other cultures or people, like even what was brought up in the previous comment of the vulnerability, the openness to share these stories, like my experiences of even talking to my father and learning things I never knew about him and my relatives. It's very fragile and delicate, like these conversations, because people don't want to be, and it relates to what Steve mentioned, of learning how to listen and protocol of what's appropriate and when, and even relating to Angelo's point too earlier about when do you take photos or not. Like now it's kind of can feel free for all, and you have to navigate these aspects. And I think that's something I've been learning, is I have to learn to say I'm sorry and try and take in a lot of consideration. But the point is, like my dad, he doesn't want to be known in history forever as a victim, right? Or people who don't want to be seen as a victim. And so it's that balance and like the nuancing. And I think it relates to a lot of the comments brought up about like perspective. Even a single person has multiple like facets or perspectives of how they process and experience and make a memory. And I was even watching the brain games with my kids last night. And it was talking about how our brains, even when someone asks you, like if you witness a car accident or something, and if the police comes up to you and says, how fast, say there was a car crash and the police says, how fast was the car when it crashed into the other car? Then our brains, we automatically want to start to estimate higher because he used the word smash. But if he said, how fast was the car going when it bumped into the other car, we will lower our estimate. And we do that because even the questions we're asking, like the ways we're framing things, it's shaping our memory, like how we are remembering things. And I was like, oh my goodness, that's what we're talking about. How these questions in history is basically like, who's the hero in history? Who do we celebrate? And how do we, and I think it hit me, one last example, and I want to open it up to everyone. And I bring this up of, for me, when I was young, I was really upset that my dad didn't speak Navajo with me, and that I didn't learn. Like it kind of dawned on me. I was like, it was like dad spoke Navajo with his sisters and brothers and family, but that wasn't like, he didn't speak it with us. And later I said, why didn't you teach me Navajo? Why weren't you speaking it with me? And he said, you never asked me to. And I used to think that's such a cop out, whatever. Like I was kind of irritated by that, but it kind of challenged me that I have to learn how to ask questions and what to ask. And it's also related to other things. Like it's a lot of complicated aspects there. But I guess that's been something I never forget. And I think about is the kind of questions we ask and how we approach them and why.
So thank you, Farina and RJ, both. We have about 2 minutes left before we're done. And I saw that Alita and James, a couple of our guests, wanted to make a comment. So please do.
Hello, Farina, this is Alita. This session has been so informative. I began my work learning about and researching the multi-layers of all the nations in this land. And I've now that I'm blind, I've been working on disability history, and I'm now learning with disability how it's being erased and disability, all of us people with disabilities, we're in every ethnicity, everywhere. And I've lived in Rapid City for 4 years when my husband finished his time in the Air Force and retired from Ellsworth. And this is bringing back so much. And now that I am totally blind, the oral histories are so important to me. And you all just gave me so much today. And thank you. And I hope as a white person, I will learn how to be better. And I'm so fortunate that our cable system, we live here in Washington State, we do get the FNX television station, and those programs have also been so helpful. And bless all of you. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Alita. Hi. I just want to say hi.
Yeah. So everybody, it is 1 o'clock Mountain Time, which I believe is, the appropriate time to stop wherever you are. I want to say thanks to everybody for joining us, to the presenters. I know, especially on a Saturday, and when I hope the weather is nice wherever you are, that you had many better options, but still chose to be here with us. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of the conference.